Hello everyone, welcome to Tufts University, Experimental College, Religion and the Graphic Novel class. I'm Dr. A. David Lewis. These are the students of the class. Hello everyone. They've had to endure a semester with me already, so pity them that they must also be on camera tonight. But the main person you're going to see through this video chat is Mr. JT Waldman. In addition to putting together Megillah Esther, an amazing graphic novel based on the story of Purim for Judaism. He is also the artistic collaborator, which if I said it properly would be artistic collaborator, with Harvey Pekar on Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me. JT, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Is the volume okay?
I believe we can hear you. I know that few people are trying to report in. Can we get a thumbs up from our people in the sky? Vicky can hear.
Someone's hearing an echo.
Someone's hearing an echo. That likely has to do with their speakers, so we'll hope that they can address that issue shortly. But we here in the classroom and one of our other remote viewers say we are go, so the floor is yours.
Okay, I assume everyone in the class read Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me. And so what I wanted to do today was to do a quick kind of how I made the book. Oop, did you lose me? You're all looking blankly. Are you all there? You're there, okay. So I wanted to just do a kind of a quick overview of how I met Harvey, how I worked with Harvey, and the kind of the process behind the book, and then just open this up to Q&A. The purpose of this book was to stimulate conversations about the topic of Israel and Palestine. So I want to hear what you guys have to say instead of me just yapping the whole time. So without further ado, I'm just going to try the screen share thing here, and hopefully we can get rolling. All right, so I just need to get rid of the preview view here. And do you see what I see? Yes? Okay.
I believe the making of Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me, PowerPoint by JT Waldman.
Live and in the flesh. Okay, so here we go. The first thing, when I present and when I talk about working with Harvey, it's just this idea that first I have to make sure that everyone knows who the man was and what did he do. I'm having some issues with this. Here we go. And so most people know of Harvey through the American Splendor film. Here on the left-hand side, in the orange is an illustration of Harvey, and the yellow is an interpretation of Paul Giamatti.
JT, we're still seeing your first screen, so I think we're waiting on the line for it to catch up.
All right.
Yes. Now we're seeing American Splendor. Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having what we worked on yesterday, David, is not happening today, so hopefully this will work. Okay, so basically, Harvey Pekar is considered to be the what I would call the father of memoir comics. He was the first person that decided, maybe this medium can be used for more than telling stories about superheroes and aliens. And it doesn't seem like a crazy novel idea today, but back in 1976, when the first issue of American Splendor came out, the idea of doing a comic book about your day-to-day life was seen as kind of groundbreaking and innovative. So the story really begins in 1976. As I said, that was the year that Harvey debuted with American Splendor. The first issue was illustrated by Robert Crumb. There's a fabulous film by the director of the movie Ghost World about the life of Crumb. I highly recommend seeing that documentary. But basically, I was born the same exact year as American Splendor. So that little baby above Spider-Man and the Hulk and Captain America, that's me. And so the idea, I just thought it was a weird that I was born his baby. So really, you have to jump to 2004, and that was the first time that that I came into contact with Harvey. I was promoting my first book, Megillat Esther, and I got to meet a gentleman by the name of Dean Hapspiel, who is basically kind of like a super connector in the comic book world. I don't know if any of you have ever seen or heard of the show Bored to Death on HBO, but he illustrated the opening credits for that. He got an Emmy Award for that, and the Zach Galifianakis character is actually based on him. I think they took some liberties with the character a little bit. So Dean is a super connector, and it was while I was at the Baltimore Comic-Con in 2004 that I just started shooting the shit with him, pardon my French, and he said, "Oh, this is really cool. You should send this to Harvey Pekar." And I said, "Why?" And he's like, "Well, he's Jewish, and he's really into his Jewish identity right now." Are you holding your hand up for a question? No, keep going. All right. So I was just kind of, I was a little bit flummoxed. I was kind of like, really? I had no idea Harvey Pekar was even Jewish. So the idea of sending him my graphic novel, which was a biblical adaptation, just seemed kind of completely out of left field. But I worked up the cojones. I ended up sending a manuscript to Harvey in 2004, and he called me back within a week and gave me input.
JT, let me just jump in and put this in some context. Megillat Esther, for those people who may not be familiar with it, is the story of Purim, but you also did a lot more than just relate the traditional story that folks may hear in synagogues. Would you just take 30 seconds or more to elaborate on that?
Sure. So the image you see here are images and examples from Megillat Esther. As the story of Megillat Esther literally means the scroll of Esther, and it is the only book in what's called the Old Testament where God's name is never mentioned. It has a female protagonist who's defined by her actions and not who she's the mother of or who she's married to, and it's the first time we ever hear the term Yehudi, which means Jew. So it's the first time that we're identified as Jews. It's a really interesting book, and it kind of took over my life for 7 years. I lived in Israel for almost 2 years, illustrated the book in Spain, and then came back to the States and did all of the inking and post-production. So it was my labor of love, and it was something that Harvey really gravitated towards. Harvey was a proponent of comic books being used for didactic purposes, for being used in anything more than just what we kind of pigeonhole it as superhero, schlock, or escapism. And so something with my work really resonated with Harvey. He really dug it. And so it was from that he kind of always framed me or knew of me as the Jewish comic book guy. And so fast forward to 2007, I was working for the Jewish Publication Society, and they wanted to publish a book on the history of Jews in comics. And so they asked me who would be an appropriate person to do the foreword. And I suggested Harvey Pekar, and within 24 hours he volunteered me to illustrate the foreword that he wrote for this book. It was a 4-page project, and it lasted about 6 weeks, and this was the means with which Harvey and I built our rapport. This is a photocopy of the script that he sent me.
Wow, that is some impressive scribble. Can you give us a sense of is that his normal scripting technique as far as you know?
Yes, Harvey was a complete and utter Luddite, and everything he did was by hand. So what you see here is exactly how he worked. I don't know how big your screen is, but you can see some stick figures. You can see on the right-hand side a bunch of things scribbled out, and you have to follow arrows that take you to other places. And I'll be honest with you, I felt like I needed to be a cryptologist working with him in this script. and it was quite scary. And so once he gave me this script, it was my job to kind of interpret it and figure out, A, what he was trying to say, and B, how do I put my spin on it? And so this next image, most of American Splendor, most of the comic books that Harvey did, the artists that he worked with followed the conventional 6-panel layout. So I felt that when I wanted to kind of my stage one of interpreting Harvey's script, I sent him back this, just so that I could kind of get a sense of his pacing. Because Harvey gave he gave very limited directions. I think because he was a writer, he had more sense of the words and not the images, and how much real estate the words would take up on a page, he never really considered. So that was the job of the artist, to kind of figure out the pacing and the flow. So my job, so that was stage one. Stage two, because Harvey had so much text, I kind of reversed the process, where I would do the lettering before I would do the final rendering of the art. So what you see here are sketches of kind of my versions of the breakdowns, and then I put in the final word balloons and captions so that I knew really how much real estate I could play with. And then from that piece, it eventually became this. And so it was, like I said, it was a 4-page preview to the book, and it was awesome. I really thought that was the end of my relationship with Harvey as a collaborator. I thought, wow, I had my 4 pages of fame with the man, and I thought that was really the end of it. And I ended up getting a call from Harvey on Thanksgiving morning at 8:30 in the morning. Harvey didn't really have a sense of propriety in terms of time. He called it at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, or at 8:30 on a Monday morning when I was getting ready for work, or like he called when the muse hit him. And so the way that we kind of worked together, it was always very organic, and he would just kind of call whenever. And following the success of American Splendor, Harvey really had a chance to kind of grow creatively, and he had the opportunity to kind of use his bully pulpit a little bit. And so what you see here are examples of 2 of the books that he did with the same publisher that published our book together. And they obviously are historical graphic novels that deal with the Beats and the Students for a Democratic Society, very specific and laser-focused topics, and things that Harvey really had something to say about. And Harvey had established this relationship with this publisher, so that when he had this next idea, he already had kind of two books under his belt working with them. And so that idea that he had was to make a comic book history of the Middle East. And that was what he called me on Thanksgiving morning at 8:30 in the morning to say, JT, I've got a project that's uniquely suited just for you. And Harvey always announced himself every time he called. I don't know if you've seen the movie. He has a very specific voice, so the idea that he needed to announce himself was kind of funny. But every time he'd say, hey.
And there was no mistaking him for Paul Giamatti or someone else. It was distinctly Harvey.
It was always known it was him. And so at 8:30 in the morning, I hear this, on my answering machine through the walls, I hear, hey, JT, this is Harvey. I think I've got a whole book for you, and I think you're uniquely suited for it. You call me back. And so that was kind of how it began. So let's see. How do I get back to... Sorry. So in 2008, Harvey sent me this script, and I don't know if you can see it, it was an untitled history of the Middle East. And it was about 140 pages like this. This was typed up by an intern who transcribed his handwritten scripts, and then an intern at the publisher would type it up and then send it to me. So I got this script in early 2008. And it was a doozy of a script. It was basically a diatribe of Harvey's journey through the history of the Middle East, and it dealt with everything from Iraq and Iran, and Mesopotamia and all of those fun things, to halfway through the script were all of these things about Israel. And it seemed like he had two different scripts going on at the same time, and he almost hijacked himself in some extent, where it wasn't really clear what his goal was for the script. And so the editor and myself pushed back, I think because some of the things in this script, you know, it was in 2008, so he's literally, I remember this one line where he says something to the effect of, well, maybe if this guy Obama wins, there'll be some changes in the Middle East. So he was really kind of all over the place, wheeling and dealing, but the Israel piece of it seemed to be more pronounced. And so after we pushed back, the editor and we asked Harvey to come back with a second draft of a script, and this one was called How I Changed My Mind About Israel. And this one was much more focused on Israel, but it didn't focus enough on how he actually changed his mind. It kind of gave us the result of the argument, not a process of how he got to that point. So that was when the third, and there was also the fact that it was a diatribe. It was one person speaking on their soapbox. And the reality is that Harvey was an autodidact. He was the ultimate armchair analyst. He had never been to Israel. All of his knowledge was completely, you know, from his own experiences, reading and talking to people. And so he wasn't approaching this from, oh, I'm going to make the all-inclusive history of the Middle East or Israel. It was, how did I change my opinions of Israel? And more importantly, what's the historical trend that this fits into, in the sense that Harvey's not the first, this isn't the first generation of people to have an idea of Israel. This has been going on for thousands of years, and how have those ideas changed over that period of time? And so that was when the third iteration of the script kind of came into being, and it required me to fly out to Cleveland, here you see our man, in January of 2010. So the book takes place over the course of one day, probably January 30th in 2010, but I was actually in Cleveland for 4 days. And while I was there for 4 days,
JT, for those not personally familiar with your biography, can we talk about, first of all, where you're coming from in relation to Cleveland?
Sure. I am in Philadelphia, born and raised, and so I flew from Philadelphia to Cleveland, a lovely hour-and-a-half flight, if that. And Cleveland and Philadelphia have a certain.
Did you live for a time in Israel or study there for any period of time?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for I lived in Israel from January 2000 to June 2001. So I was in Israel for the first full year of the Second Intifada. I lived on a kibbutz for 5 months. I worked as a counselor for a program called the Alex Muss High School in Israel. And then I studied in a yeshiva, which is basically a religious school, for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week for an entire year. So Harvey kind of, he knew that I had spent time in Israel. He knew that I spoke Hebrew, and because my first book was a biblical text, he saw me as the Jewish boy chick, and he kind of he literally called me boy chick every once in a while. So he deferred to the Israel thing for me in some way. And like I said, Harvey was this intellectual Lothario. He had many different projects going on with multiple artists, and so I'm sure his relationship with each artist was different. My relationship with him we only talked about Judaism and baseball. Those were really the only things we communicated about. And so yeah, that was how our relationship went. And so the final book is the result of this third iteration of the script, which is really 3 stories in one. It's the dialogue piece of Harvey and I talking about making a book about Israel. It's the memoir piece of literally me pulling out stories from Harvey's childhood and throughout his life that were kind of turning points and moments that he recalled, where he really kind of formed his opinions about Israel and then pivoted on them. And then the final piece was creating a historical framework to articulate the idea that the Holy Land, the Promised Land, that has existed, the promises have changed throughout the years. So after Harvey died, it was actually his widow, Joyce Brabner, who came up with the title, Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me. And the title is amazing because it plays off of the idea of the promised land and how every generation makes a different promise to some extent. And so the historical piece of the book is meant to be a historical survey of the Jewish people's relationship to the land. It's not meant to be a comprehensive history of Judaism. I think some of the reviews kind of got it wrong. It's not meant to be the history of Judaism. It's the history of the Jewish people's relationship to the land, which are different. So it's a subtle difference, but that was really the focus of the...
Well, I'm fascinated by this discussion of the artistic process, and I think that it certainly fits what we have seen of Pekar's personality in terms of just sort of winging it. And I'm kind of amazed by the fact that the length of the story and the shape that it took was so much determined by the publisher. And I wonder about that because you'd think Harvey would have enough pull to sort of demand the length that he wanted.
Yes and no. I think, look, Harvey didn't have the publication limitations were based on budgets and pricing that were completely not in Harvey's wavelength and frequency. I don't imagine. There was never a moment when I remember Harvey saying anything to the publisher, to the editor that we worked with, I want to add more. It always seemed like we needed to figure out ways to condense and kind of keep it pithy and moving forward. But yeah, I mean, commerce is always going to determine, a lot of the constraints of products, and Harvey and I are, just part of the cogs. So did that answer your question? Silence?
The question was to you, Julian. Did that address your answer? Would that address your question?
Yes, it's a fascinating process. And I'm interested that your stories with Harvey and being called bullshit and whatnot. Perfectly charming. I think it's a good window into the sense of collaboration and sort of Harvey's more writerly, hands-off kind of approach and the evolution of the story. I wonder how much you feel that you not only collaborated, but because your involvement was so great, do you feel that you were a co-writer in some meaningful sense?
We've momentarily lost JT's audio feed. Hang on
Can
one
you hear
second.
me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was getting a feedback from Julian, so I needed to switch things up. Harvey always deferred to the artist in the sense that you saw his scripts. He didn't give much direction. Whenever there's a moment in the book where there are two people speaking or commenting on the action of the story, whether it's two women walking down the streets in Cleveland, or there's a moment where these Israelis are reading a newspaper. Whenever there was two people commenting on the action, that was the only creative direction that Harvey gave. So he was very laissez-faire with kind of the visualization of the process. And I think, and even in the biblical part of the story, he was very, he deferred to me. And there's that part in the beginning where he's like, hey, JT, didn't you say something about there being a discrepancy in the Bible? Like, that was worked in because that was how he would just defer to me on that part. But if it was anything having to do with like anything from the 40s to the 80s, that was all him, because I didn't exist for most of that time.
JT, let me interrupt you just one more. Let me interrupt you just one more second. I'm sorry. I do want to introduce one other person to this conversation, just so you know that she's there, and so that she knows we see her. We have J. Willow Wilson with us tonight. Willow, welcome to the conversation. Can you speak aloud? Are you there?
Yes. I just figured out how to unmute myself.
Okay, great. So we have Willow with us as well, and I think I'm muting each person who's not speaking, including myself, to limit on the echoes in here, because we're all jerks and not wearing headphones. That includes everyone here. So I want to hand the discussion back over to JT, but make sure we still have plenty of time for any commentary by Willow, Julian, the class, and the room. So thank you for this bold venture into technology, Willow. It's great to have you with us. And JT, you have the floor. Wait a minute, you.
All right, so I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint so that we can get through that and get to the Q&A and dialogue. Sound good? Okay, so let's see how this is going to work again. No, hold on. And in a moment, here we go. Okay, do you see what I see? Post-its? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so in January of 2010, I went out to Cleveland, and it was my job to wrangle together and project manage this endeavor. So what you see here is my attempt to weave together those three stories. So you'll see three different Post-its, and each column is kind of, one's his memoirs, one are the story of Harvey and I, and one is the historical piece. On the right-hand side, you see kind of like a schematic of how many pages I have for each kind of moment in the story. So these were all of the, thank you for the color coding. I'm a huge Post-it guy. I believe in Post-its as a creative tool, like a Sharpie. Like, I think that they're part of they should be part of everyone's toolkit. So yeah, I was that anal and had color coding for my themes and the different narrative tracks. And Harvey literally thought I was insane. I showed him the diagram on the right with all the little squares so that you could see how many pages are laid out, and he literally looked at it like it was Chinese. So these aspects of the production process he just didn't get it, and so that's where he really deferred to me. So to Julian's question of how much of a collaborator and writer was I felt like I had just as an equal place at the table with him. And for obvious reasons, because of the technology and the production process, I was kind of leading the dance a little bit. Watching Julian's camera while he's moving around is really cool too, by the way. Okay, so moving on. I also started doing some sketches. So these are some of the earliest what are called thumbnail sketches, which are small sketches the size of someone's thumb. These are the first sketches that I did of Harvey. And my first attempt to try and visualize his parents and myself. Originally, I was not in version 1 or 2 of the script, and I was roped in as a narrative foil by the editor. And the editor was supposed to fly out with me to Cleveland, but his plane got basically thwarted by bad weather. So he would have been in the story, but because of weather circumstances, it was just me. So that's kind of interesting.
JT, Harvey is a known autobiographer, but with collaboration, how difficult was it to include yourself? I mean, I don't recall seeing you explicitly in Megillat Esther. Was this natural or self-conscious, or do you consider the JT character in the book to be someone totally distinct from you?
I was petrified. I had no desire to do any kind of memoir comics. There was an anthology that came out a couple years ago called True Porn, which were autobiographical sexual stories, and I found the first volume and I was like, wow, this is awesome, I'll submit to the second volume, and I submitted to the second volume and was rejected. That was the beginning and the end of my memoir career as far as I thought. And so, yeah, I did not want to be I did not want to be in the book, but it just seemed like it was a necessary trope for the story, and it works better as Harvey being in a dialogue. It makes the conversational facet made it much more fluid, I guess. So drawing myself was never really one of the goals of the story, and I found it kind of awkward trying to do that. Anyway, moving right along, it was important for me to have buy-in from Harvey because of the artistic liberty that he gave me, and also from the publisher, the editor we were working with, since it was their first time working with me. And so what you see here are examples of what I called my style guide pages, which were 3 different pages that were from different historical moments of the book, and I could demonstrate here to Harvey and to the publisher what a fully realized page would look like, with the lettering, with all of the color washes. So everything that you see here is done by hand, except for the lettering, which was done digitally by Charles Pritchett up in Canada. So all of this stuff, everything that has to deal with Harvey in the past and everything that was historical was done analog or by hand, and everything where it's Harvey and I in current times is colored digitally. So what you see here is a moment in Zubel's where Harvey and I are interacting with the Zubel's brothers, but everything is colored digitally to help separate it from the past. And so before Harvey passed away, these pages here were the only rendered pages that he saw. Up until that point, our process was he would send me rewrites of the script, and then I would send my corrections or my additions, and then while I was waiting to get feedback back from him, I would work on the artwork. And that was pretty much how we flowed together. For the first six, for the first half.
JT, this strikes me as a good moment to throw a prompt to Willow Wilson, if I might. Willow, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay, she wasn't sure at first, but now she knows she is. JT has been talking about being a collaborator in an autobiographical comic, one, of course, that deals with personal feelings, faith, perspectives, philosophy. Now, you're one of the other comic book creators that we have here as a writer yourself of Cairo and of Air. Can you just talk for a minute or talk in dialogue with JT about how much of yourself naturally falls into a comic versus how much you might try to hold back something of yourself from a comic?
Well, some brilliant person whose name I'm forgetting now said that all art is autobiographical, and I think that's really true, at least in my experience. I think even when you're writing, whether it's a comic or a novel or prose nonfiction or what have you, you can't help yourself from letting some of your personality and your own experiences kind of leak through, even if it's a subject that you think has nothing to do with your own personal history or that does not touch on your deepest beliefs. I think it all kind of comes out, and I think that's part of what makes art valuable is that we see through the lens of whoever is making the art, whether it's the artist or the writer, even the editor. I think art, is very much a personal experience, both for the people who receive it as readers or as audiences, and for the people who make it. And so, it's not just about the opinions that we express, the political or cultural or religious or what have you. It's also about what we don't express and what comes through subconsciously. So, I mean, to me, that's part of the fun, certainly as a reader, to see, not only the opinions that the artists or writers that I'm reading choose to show, but also sometimes the ways in which we tip our hands without ever really meaning to. because we can't help but see the world from our own unique perspective.
JT, would you like to pick that up or
if I
respond
had
to
my
that?
video on, I was doing my fingers, which means I agree with Willow's comments about art being everyone. There's the way that quote was told to me was all paintings are self-portraits. That was how they explained it in art school. So every time you're drawing somebody else, you're still drawing yourself in some way. And I think for me, the idea of the JT in print and the JT in reality are very distinct. And experiencing Harvey as a person, not as a character, it was very clear that they were very different. So you're dealing with, like, so right now I have to grapple with the JT that now the public sees through the work, and then there's the JT that my friends and my family know, and then there's, you know, the people that don't even know me as JT, they know me as Hefe or Fedge or Jeff or any of the other names that I go by. So I think name and kind of how we present ourselves is always kind of a facet of art in any way, whether you're painting landscape or painting landscape dogs.
One of the beautiful things about this technology is we have the benefit of some librarian help. One of the viewers following us today is Vicky Malloy. If I'm not being improper, Vicky is a librarian, among, I'm sure, many other things in Iowa. And Vicky, you found the quote. Would you mind filling us in on the quote that JT and Willow were looking for? Oh, Vicky doesn't have her audio on at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to credit this one
It was Bellini. It was Bellini.
It was Fellini. That's correct. But we're going to give those points to Vicky Malloy. No points for Mr. Waldman just yet, although he is very much in the lead. Sorry, JT. Please go ahead and continue.
All right. Well, there's no point system here. All right. So everything changed for the book and for me on July 12th, 2010. You know, I don't really know many famous or relative famous people, so when I found out through a friend of mine texted me saying, "Oh my God, it's on the internet, Harvey died." So it was a very surreal moment. I'd never lost. 10 minutes after I found out that he passed away, I got a phone call asking for comments, and it was just such a weird moment to be kind of infringed upon by other people. And no one in my life in Philadelphia knew Harvey, so it was mourning in a bubble. And obviously the main questions were, you know, how are we going to finish this book without him? And so the publisher and Harvey's wife, Joyce, were committed to continuing the book. So what you see here, these are the page on the left, it's page 94. That was the page I was working on when Harvey passed. So for some reason that page kind of resonates with me. And so it was my job to basically finish the script up at that we had and follow the process that Harvey and I had laid out. And I'll get to a little bit later about how I finished the script. So I'm just going to plow through just some of those images from the book. Again, showing how within medieval times, this is an example of what's called Jewish micrography, which is kind of small calligraphy. I ended up making it bigger calligraphy. The map here of Jerusalem as the center of the earth is based on an actual map from I believe it's the 10th century. And then these are, this is Catherine the Great on the left. And then these are statues of false prophets, Shabbatai Tzvi and Jacob Frank. All of these were kind of moments that directly and indirectly dealt with land and kind of the ramifications of not having land. When you don't have a place to be safe or to call your own, you search for you know, saviors in other arenas. It was also important for me to establish what was going on, to provide a context for what was going on in the rest of the world while Israel was forming. So the idea of kind of what was going on in the art world during the early 20th century, how can I use that to help kind of frame the conversation? And so these kind of, I call the modernist era, which would be kind of the the 20s and 30s is influenced by a designer that I was obsessed with in college named Rennie McIntosh. So these are based on just designs of his. These are images from propaganda posters from Israel. And so my hope was that as the story goes forward and Harvey kind of added his take on things, I could add some of the visual history of Judaism as well. So I call this the Mr. Miyagi method of teaching, where you're giving information without people really knowing that they're getting it. And so it was important for me to kind of establish a visual history as well. And in between, mix it in with these moments of Harvey and I in very specific places in Cleveland. So this is Galucci's, which is a small Italian market. And to touch upon Willow's point, this idea that we kind of, I was very conscious of the things that I said in the story and what things I mentioned, but there's this moment when I walk into Galucci's and I say, oh, it's just like the Italian market in Philly. And it's the only time in the book where you know where I'm from. And it's like, it's one of those small moments where it's like, oh, this guy JT is adding his point of reference. And it's those little lines that are, in my sense, I found important because it gives my sense of who I am. But the real question that everyone had was kind of how do you finish this without the writer? And so there was really 3 pieces of that puzzle that needed to be filled in. As I said before, much of the process with Harvey was him and I talking and me saying, well, I need something from the 60s to understand where you were at in the 60s. And so the script that we had, I knew what Harvey was thinking about today and kind of in the late 90s, but I was missing his opinion from the 70s and 80s. And so it was when his wife Joyce said that Harvey wrote some op-ed piece, I don't know when, but some op-ed piece in the 70s or 80s about Israel. Good luck finding it. And then that was it. And so then the librarian Carol Walenchek, who's featured in the book, she actually dug them up and found them. And so these images here, those are the actual PDFs. And that's Harvey kind of standing on the text. And so he wrote an op-ed piece about Israel not building settlements in I believe it was in the area near the Golan. Whoa, sorry, jumping ahead. And then a week later, he gets rebuked by this gentleman here in the center who calls him an ignoramus and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And you find out that this guy is a rabbi. And what's the chutzpah of this guy to be saying such horrible things? Because the next week, Harvey comes back and rebukes the guy who rebuked him and says, you know, this guy knows who I am. Like, he's my cousin. And it was this moment where the idea earlier in the story of Sinat Hinam, which is this, yes, of course, Vicky, leave it to the librarians to save the story. And just as an aside, I worked as a librarian in college. The first place that I did a public lecture about my work with Harvey was at the Association of Jewish Librarians. I am a huge proponent of librarians and libraries. There's a great online comic book called Unshelved, which is all about librarians, so there you go. Anyway, so a librarian was a linchpin in finishing the book, and it was just this moment of Harvey. It was an interesting echo chamber of Harvey kind of remixing himself, so to speak. The next piece of the puzzle that I needed to fill was actually filled by a video that I had taken while I was working with Harvey in Cleveland. So I had about 25 minutes of video footage of Harvey and I talking about the book, and I ended up using the last 15 minutes of that video, or parts of that video, to create the dialogue for the last 15 pages or so of the book. So nothing that Harvey says was written by me. Everything came from the man. And then the final piece was, you know, do we want to acknowledge? And so this is these are examples of that conversation. That's what these pages are. So all of this was Harvey and I in the video. Unfortunately, I can't show the video to you guys online because this is being recorded. But if I were doing this as a live presentation, as a performance, so to speak, I would show you that video. Anyway, so the one other thing, which is, I guess, the pink elephant, was do we acknowledge Harvey's passing in the book? And then that's where the decision was brought in to invite Joyce Brabner, his widow, to write the epilogue. And Joyce, I think, did a phenomenal job of bringing the story kind of full circle again, because for those of you that didn't read the book, the epilogue basically takes place when Joyce is going to the funeral of Harvey's mother, and he gets to talk about what he wants for his own funeral. And so it's very self-aware, and it's quite poignant and beautiful, and it's the only part that really acknowledges that he has passed away. And so the video, the librarian who saved the day, Carol, and Joyce's epilogue were really kind of the final kind of pieces of the puzzle that needed to come together. So now what I like to do here is I just like to kind of point out the enormous legacy of the man. The Eisners, Will Eisner gets the Eisners named after him, but and Harvey Kurtzman has the Harveys. But when you look at the comic books that have been coming out for the last 20 years, the number of memoir comics and comics that deal with health and medical issues, Harvey Pekar was the man who pioneered that. So I just think it's important to kind of give the man the credit that he deserves and recognize that that we're all kind of working off of his shoulders. Yep, our cancer year comes in there as well. There's actually an entire conference devoted to it's called graphic medicine. It's comic books that deal specifically with health issues. So Cancer Vixen, Mom's Cancer, Stitches, Our Cancer Year, any book, or Epileptic, any book that deals with any kind of health, physical or mental. It's amazing how they're using comics now to improve the bedside manner of doctors. I've already been invited twice to speak at Penn State's Medical College because their fourth-year students, as part of their humanities requirement, have to make comic books. And so I was brought in as the comic book professional to help them with their processes and their stories. So it's just interesting how his work is kind of echoing in other ways. This is a picture of Joyce and I. In October, Joyce unveiled the memorial sculpture in honor of Harvey. She launched a Kickstarter campaign, raised close to $40,000 to create this sculpture. The figure of Harvey is in bronze, and then behind him is a comic book illustration that is made to look like bronze, but it's actually fiberglass. And on the backhand, on the flip side of this board, it's a treated kind of blackboard with chalk for people to draw their own comics on the other side. And all of the drawers of the desk open up. All of the drawers, and it's meant to be kind of an interactive.
It's worth pointing out that the desk there that is in Cleveland was actually part of a global Kickstarter campaign. People helped to raise the funds, and it included Alan Moore, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, if you can see on the desk, there's like a white sheet that's got like little dots of columns. Those are all the names of the people that contributed to the campaign. And as a way to raise the funds, Joyce, in her inimitable wisdom, decided to rope in her friend Alan Moore, and they ended up doing kind of like a private video chat like we're doing here, where people could ask questions to Alan Moore, all in an effort to support Harvey and his legacy. And I believe Joyce is hot to make more of these kind of commemorative sculptures for other big important people in the literary world of Cleveland. I really give her kudos that she's done an amazing job of building this and bringing the people together to make it happen. One of the other things that's important to also understand is the library, and Vicki will appreciate this. The library where the book takes place is now recognized as a literary landmark. I believe it's the 124th literary landmark to be established. And the quote here that Harvey says, "Ordinary life is pretty complex stuff." I can't. You can't say it any better than that. That's really this man's his epigram, his mission. And then my hope is that my work, the work of Sequart, and hopefully everyone in this class, that you realize that comics can deal with ordinary stuff in amazing ways. So that formally ends this part of my presentation. Now I would love to hear what everyone has to say.
All right, I know that as you were talking, Dr. Julian Darius, once again, of Sequart, Sequart, I'll get the pronunciation right someday, had one particular point about the medium in which you're working, in which Harvey was working. Julian, can I pass that thought back to you?
Absolutely. I wanted to ask, because you talked about the power of the medium and its use in medical issues, and also obviously the influence of autobiographical comics. What is it about comics that seem to make them as a medium powerful in these ways, both in medicine and in telling these rich stories that seem very personal? Is there something intimate about the medium, or what is it about the combination of words and pictures on the page that creates this effect?
So I'm an avid comic book reader today, and there's I don't know if you all are familiar with Image Comics. They're the one of the main kind of, besides Marvel and DC, and they're famous because 20 years ago they were founded by a bunch of artists who left the big guys to form their own company. And they're doing this really interesting ad campaign to celebrate their 20th anniversary, where it's just photos of different comic book creators working in their studios, and then it's like these funny quotes that they're saying. And if you were to read I highly recommend going to the Image Comics blog to kind of see some of them, because the quotes that they have from these artists, they make comic book artists seem like kind of freewheeling, anarchistic megalomaniacs, because they all come to comic books because when you're making comics, you're the director, the cinematographer, the costume maker, the actor, the lighting designer for a movie, and you have control over the whole thing. And when you see all these quotes kind of aggregated together, you realize that all comic book creators are control freaks, and the reason that we work in the medium is because we're able to exert so much control over a small domain. You make TV shows, you make movies, you have notes from producers, or if you're George Lucas, you just get to make whatever you want, and then we all know what happens there. So comics allow, I think, this, and if you really want kind of an academic approach, just read Scott McCloud. His show and tell Synergy, I think that explains it. Comic books in America have a very bad rap of being very puerile. When you look at Japan or places like France or Belgium, they're adult. They're read in these kind of big monographs that are very serious, and it's thanks to Frederick Wortham and the McCarthy era that in America comic books have been kind of pinned as this puerile, childish, stupid thing, and it's been now in the last, I would say, 15, 20 years that the medium has kind of come from being an outsider form, that there are now, when Chris Ware's work was in the Whitney, I think in 1998, that was a huge moment for comics as a legitimization. And then, obviously Mouse's Pulitzer legitimizes it in literature. But I think that to your question, Julian, of why is this medium, what is the synergy between text and image, and why is it so good with telling personal stories, and how is it used for medicine? I believe that comics can be deployed in any environment. You look at the use of the career of Will Eisner. He worked for 20 years writing comic books for the American Army, doing preventative maintenance magazines. Scott McCloud did the user manual for Google Chrome when it came out in 2008. You have the guys in England who work with the RSA that do these awesome dry erase board illustrations of very intense lectures about economics and what have you. So they can, and when you think about just all of the websites and our iPhones and iPads, everything are text and images now, everything, and the union of them in sequence. There's a reason that wireframes and storyboards, they're kind of the bastard cousins of comic strips, and they are the formations of all media that we have now. And so there's an immediacy that you can have with comics where all I need is a pen and paper, or, I mean, I've seen people try and, in art school, everyone's, painting with bodily fluids and doing things like that. So you just need a liquid and some sort of material and surface to work on. And then that immediacy is what I think enables such unique points of view to come about. and if you were to go into a comic book store today, and a comic book store that has an independent section, not just the mainstream ones, you would be blown away with the diversity of aesthetic styles, of stories. It really can grapple anything and deal with any topic. I'm hoping that in the next 20 years, there'll be more kind of academic and scientific scrutiny, where they'll have, somebody at the University of Pennsylvania will have a paragraph of, Moby Dick given to 5 kids, and then they'll give them the same story as a comic book, and then they'll give them the same vignette as an animated thing, and they'll have, electrodes plugged up, and we'll be able to see, which parts of the brain fire up more. I would probably make a bet that comic books will have both sides of their brains firing up. The animation will make them passive, and the literature will kind of only touch on one side. So there's a certain
JT, let me actually back that point. Just recently, so we have our class here at Tufts. We're at the Tufts Experimental College. We have a graduate, an alum of Tufts University, Neil Cohn, who was recently published, I think this week, in the Journal of Cognitive Behavior, Journal of Cognition. He's been doing research using Peanuts cartoons, Charles Schulz cartoons, about when we read comics, what different parts of the brain are lit up, and that a greater, I believe, span of the brain is lit up when we're reading comics than when we're engaging in just prose. One of our chat members here, Forrest Helvey, he's going to pop up because he just heard his name, Forrest Helvey, was actually giving the citation for what you were. Let's let him wave. Hi, Forrest. Forrest did some legwork for us. He found that MSNBC Digital Network did cover what you were alluding to, or maybe what you were thinking of. Stuart Fox, Defense Department to use comic books as art therapy for PTSD persons, so people suffering from PTSD. So you are, I think, right on the pulse of things there. Now, before we have run out of time, I want to give JT a chance to respond to some of the questions that my class has here. We've been studying comics and religion and their interaction and the creation of them and the presentation of them pretty much all semester. And I was hoping I could... Hello? Are you guys still back there? Hi. Okay. Hi, we're here. So if you wouldn't mind fielding a few of their questions, we'd appreciate it. Good. Okay. So I will. I'll ask one of my students, or one or more of my students, if they'd like to present a question, and then I'll unmute JT. He can take over. We still have Dr. Julian Darius with us here, as well as support from Vicky Malloy and Forrest Helvey and anyone else who's listening at home. So, guys, hearing what JT has been discussing, having read Not the Israel My Parent Promised Me, any familiarity you might have with Harvey Pekar, what immediate questions, you're looking at the back of my head, fascinating. What immediate questions come to mind? Vincent, is that a hand?
Yeah. So you were talking about how comics are kind of treated as a little childish in America. And I was wondering if that might be used to your advantage in this case, seeing as how this is obviously a very hotly debated topic to be discussing. So do you think the fact that comics are looked at as kind of childish maybe took some of the tension and some of the heat off of this work? Do you think it helped in some way?
Does the fringe status that's been commonly associated with comics actually provide a greater forum for this? I think Vincent has a good point there. JT, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think you're right on. I see myself as a seat Jew. Seat are the fringes that hang at the bottom of a tallis, which is the only really Jewish garb that we are supposed to wear. Kippas are not innately Jewish. But as seat and the idea of exalting the fringes and finding like fringe festivals tend to be the edgiest kind of theater and performance art that's kind of pushing the envelope. So I do think that comic books, because they're seen as kind of puerile and not dealing with intense subject matter, can kind of get under the radar a little bit. Obviously, that has changed since Mouse kind of blew up the whole idea that comics can't deal with serious subject matter. I think the title of the book is also a little bit problematic. It's meant to be sensational. And so within certain organizations, within certain Jewish organizations, for example, they wouldn't promote the book because of the title. So it had nothing to do with the fact that it was a comic book. It had more to do with just the way that they perceived it to be contentious, so to speak. I think that it's funny. I think it also tends to be somewhat generational. You know, older people generally used to say, "Oh, that's so interesting. You do serious comic, Bible comics, comics about Israel." Ooh, you know, they get kind of like, And then younger people are like, "Oh yeah, duh. Like there's comic books about zombie Jesus. Why wouldn't there be one about Israel?" And there's a lot about Israel. I think one of the questions that I got when I was at the University of Kentucky in Lexington was, you know, are there any examples of kind of right-leaning or less critical takes of Israel? Because it seems like with Maus and with, you know, Joe Sacco's work, Sarah Glidden's work, that there seems to be a lot more kind of coming from a critical angle. And the answer is there are some. The best example I have is a book called Homeland. So that book has a completely different kind of goal than what our book had. So I guess the Purell thing kind of works on both edges, but I generally I know that my relationship to comics are very serious and adult. Granted, I've got figures and toys all around me, but I guess that's I've really incriminated myself there. But I think it's just how you approach the work, and I tried to be.
I muted their laughter, but you got a good laugh from the group here on that. Did anyone else want to pose a question for JT? Yeah.
So I guess this is more of a stylistic question, but I was interested how in the novel you create like multiple like overlapping narratives, not just through a history of Israel, but also from like an art historical standpoint, like through your illustrations. And so I was curious if the references to art history were inspired by the content, or somehow the content inspired the way that you rendered the images.
And if I can piggyback onto that question, you do deal with Islam in addition to dealing with Judaism and Christianity. There's a lot of discussion about any prohibitions Islam has towards depictions of individuals, and I know you deal with one panel that actually has Harvey say, I don't know that we're actually made in God's image, so what do you think? And you give a kind of disheveled picture of Harvey. So if you don't mind tying those two together, the art historical part, but it includes a history of the geometric art, the architectural art from Islamic culture.
But that's also interesting, I think, because like, say like illuminated manuscripts, that was an art form that was like shared amongst those, you know, different cultures. So there was a lot of, if you think about like the way that history is shared and, you know, histories overlap, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Were you here able to hear the entirety of the question?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Look, part of, and I think you can look to some of the anti-Semitic history. Like Jews have been always called kind of vampires of cultures, and the idea, the second commandment is don't make graven images. You know, don't be artists. Don't have iconography because people will, you know, worship the golden calf. And then immediately after we have the golden calf, the story is of the complete description of the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So the Bible is very contradictory, but for me, I guess I was in art history. I had an interdisciplinary degree in art history and fine art in college. So I always approached things through the art history lens first. That's just how I approach history. I'd much rather learn about the cultural output of a society than who they conquered and what, you know, treaty was signed. There were certain parts of the story that I knew that I wanted, like, so I knew that I had to have some pieces be reminiscent of illuminated manuscripts, just because there's a rich Jewish history of them, and it was the comic book of the Middle Ages. So it's like on a comic book level and on a kind of a Jewish Christian level it fit. I knew the Byzantine mosaic pieces I knew I wanted to do because that's just, it's my sweet spot of my style. I'm very kind of anal retentive, and I've been called a Harv vacuist, which is a term used to describe people who kind of fear empty spaces. So yes, I'm playing to my strengths. But there are other things where, like, I've always been obsessed with Rennie McIntosh, and when I found that way to rope in his design into the book, I was just so excited. So there were certain things that I think kind of happened organically, and then other things where it's like, well, if I'm going to be doing something, that's dealing with, the year 70 or kind of just when the temple was destroyed, I can't, if I were to draw it like, and not to put down like, work like the Age of Bronze, but if I were to draw it in a modern way, it takes the reader out of that time and place. And so back to what I said before of this kind of Mr. Miyagi method, if I can give you a sensibility of what it might have been like just through the aesthetics, then I can add just another layer of meaning. And again, that was the part that Harvey totally let me run with. Medium and the message kind of form and content all building on top of each other. And then there were other moments like there was the part where it's Harvey in the 60s in Chicago, and I make everything kind of look kind of loose and kind of Saul Bass-ish. I ended up using what's called zip tone paper, which was the paper that comic book artists used in the 60s. So I was trying to kind of mimic, materials from that time as well. So there was some sort of a method to my madness, but some of it was kind of fluid, and some of it was reacting to the content, and other parts it was like, ooh, I get to use the things I want to do, like Rennie McIntosh. I think the trick with art is to project like this is you have to find your own kind of angles and hooks that make it interesting for you, because the reader can tell when you're bored. You know which pages I was rushing through. And you can tell that from a lot of mainstream comics as well, and indie comics.
Let me bring in one other voice here. Forrest Helvey is joining the conversation, and he had a comment to make. We'll return to the classroom here in just a second. But Forrest, you wanted to say something about the fringe power of comics, and were you tying that into art history, or did you have a separate comment?
Well, the comment that I was looking to make had to relate to the issue, and particularly the issue of religion. Just reading some recent comments, I was just thinking of the Daily Show, The War on Christmas, and how you can't bring up certain topics. But it's interesting to me how in superhero comics there are fan-driven rules, and if creators behave a certain way, they're going to hear about it. Gail Simone was just talking about this on Twitter in terms of if you're to write for the Amazing Spider-Man, you're going to basically be signing up for hate mail and threats. But yeah, with indie comics, it seems to me that there's so much more freedom for the topics that you can address. And JT's just brought up a great example of how you can play with form to fit the content. Whereas in superhero comics, in that genre, the genre that everyone generally thinks of when you think comics, you have to portray the characters in a certain way. If you deviate too much, you're going to get penalized, and a lot of time that is with fanboy criticism and with the dollar. So I think in relation to the issue of religion, that's where I think you find indie comics are much more welcome by the Academy, and I think that there's a real acceptance of them because you don't have that hang-up that maybe the more mainstream comics have. And so just really kind of resonated a lot with some of my research, some of the conversations I've had with other people teaching in the universities, that it's the indie comic that really is, I think, just exploding on college campuses.
And JT, one thing I think we skipped over, Forrest has a very good point, but one thing we might have skipped over was how much did you have to align your own thoughts or sensibilities with Harvey's when it came to Judaism, Israel, stylistic depictions in religion? Were you guys naturally on the same wavelength? I don't want to override Forrest's point because it's a very good point. But I do think that part of the conversation hasn't been addressed yet.
Yeah, Harvey and I parked in the same parking garage. Two completely different generations. I have a college degree. Harvey never went to college. I lived in Israel. I studied, in a yeshiva. We came from completely different backgrounds and kind of came to similar conclusions. And in regards to the artwork, he he was always he just deferred to the artists that he worked with. He never told Crumb what to do. He didn't tell Dean Haspel what to do, and he didn't tell me what to do. So that was the artwork was that's my kind of stamp, I guess. But in terms of like where Harvey and I kind of stood politically, we were on the same page completely, and that's what's kind of so fun places. And
you can go to Forrest. So I feel like I stole from Forrest there his point about what indie artists, what indie creators are allowed to do versus those under a more mainstream spotlight. Sorry about that, Forrest. So I guess you guys have some alignment of view, but go ahead.
I was cognizant. I was American Splendor fans in the sense that I needed to have that wink and nod because that's the brand that Harvey represents. So to the same point that Forrest made where, like, you know, if you do certain things to Spider-Man, people are going to get their panties in a bunch. I had to have a certain moment in the book or moments where it's, you know, American Splendor-ish. So there's Toby, there's I don't know if people caught it, there's a Toby reference in there. There's pages that all of the panels are done like little files, folder files, because that was his world then. But I was aware of the form. I did my hat tip to the form, and then I moved on. And I completely agree. Within independent comics, you have a lot more freedom now to kind of play with these things. That being said, you know, with the new DC reboot and Marvel's reboot, they're doing some creative things. But the real interesting stuff is in the indie scene. It has been, and it will continue.
All right. Folks here in the classroom, did you have any... He's not leaving for any bad reason. We have an open door policy. Did you have any further questions that you wanted to pose to JT on either the subject of Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me, or the content or the process? Yeah, Jackie.
Does it have to be about the book?
I don't suppose it has to be about the book. Let's keep it within the academic realms of reason. But go ahead. Okay, so Jackie, you either want to stand or shift or something, because my big head's in the way.
Okay, I was just curious how you got into doing comics. You talked about going to art school and living in Israel for a while and going to yeshiva. How did that transfer into, you know, illustrating comics for Harvey Pekar? I don't know. I guess in my head I kind of missed a leap there.
Well, I grew up reading comic books. I was a comic book geek. I was the kid that, you know, after school, I was rushing home to read my comic books and then draw them. So comics were kind of my gateway drug to art, in the sense that, like, I studied sculpture in college and I became an art history major, but like my whole worldview started first with comics. I know what a Pyrrhic victory is because of comics. I know what rancor and strife. I mean, I learned my SAT scores went through the roof as a kid because of reading comics. And then in terms of getting to Harvey, you know, I graduated from college and I knew that I wanted to make a comic book. I knew that if I didn't fulfill that childhood dream, that I would be haunted by my childhood self for the rest of my life. So I said, screw it, I'm young, I don't have any family or responsibility that I need to worry about, I'm going to make this comic book. And I thought it would be a year-long process, and the Esther book took 7 years. And then along the way, I got to meet Will Eisner and Scott McCloud and then Harvey Pekar. And then I thought just the fact of meeting these guys was going to be enough. I never in a million years thought I would work with Harvey Pekar. When I was a kid, I didn't know he existed. You know, American Splendor was not in, you know, the drugstore where I picked up the X-Men. I wasn't frequenting head shops, so that's the only place that it was really around in the 80s. So, like, he wasn't on my radar until the movie came out. And then it was like, wow, like, this guy wants to work with me. I felt like I won the golden ticket. But the art part, in terms of, you know, do I see myself as an illustrator? And then I also have a degree in technical design and interaction design and user experience stuff. But everything is always kind of through the world of comics. I dream in comics. I see the world in text and images all around me. I see work like photographers like Zoe Strauss who use text and image together in ways, and it's just exhilarating. Like, I see that as comics. Like, I'm just always looking for that kind of modality. It's my go-to.
I think you're, to some degree, preaching to the choir here, and I use that phrase punnily. especially as we're discussing religion and comics. Yes, punneling. Yes, I said that. And Forrest, helpfully in the chat room, pointed out the University of Kansas Center for Learning. Forrest, is that correct? Is using comics to those goals?
Yeah, the University of Kansas, their Center for Learning, they're actually one of the places you go to. I teach developmental English at college level, and it's actually their links vocabulary strategy. And that one, they specifically refer to, you have the word, you have the definition context, and you also pair that with images. So the whole idea when we talk about I'm improving my vocabulary, it's because you're actually contextualizing the words and the definitions with the images. So there's actually a lot of research to back that up. So it's just funny that JT mentioned that because there's good teaching behind that.
I think that the mistake that's made by a lot of people who only engage comics art through Garfield or what have you is that comics are easy. If children can understand it, then it must be simple. But what gets overlooked is the reason children can understand it, at least initially, at least the straightforward comics, is that it is using so much of the mind. It is using so much of the brain, the visual and the verbal cognition centers. I do want to give Julian one last chance here. He actually posed a really fun question over on the chat site. Julian, can you want to voice a final thought?
Well, given how you grew up loving comics and they were your entree into art history and then into making comics themselves, how does it feel at this point in your young life to be a part of comics history?
It's why I'm on this planet, I guess. It was important for me with Esther to prove that comics can be used as a serious rabbinic tool, and then working with Harvey was whipped cream. I felt like, you know, having one book out and being able to walk into a comic book store and see, like, my dream was to be able to walk into a comic book store and see my name and my work next to someone, you know, Superman and Batman and all that stuff. And I got that in 2005. And then working with Harvey has been like the cherry on top. And if I'm part of the larger comic book history, awesome. For me, it's more about I'm doing what anyone who knows me as a kid or as an adult, like, I'm doing what's natural to me. I don't know what else I could be doing. So yeah, I'm honored, I'm humbled, it's petrifying. I'm scared of what I have to do next.
What are you? That's a fair question. That's a good point for us to wrap up on. What are you doing next?
Perhaps you would like to answer that question.
Well, no, I didn't mean that to be as self-serving as it sounds. Okay, so the point of disclosure, JT and I may be working on a short piece together for a colonial comics book forthcoming in 2012. But besides that, would you like to talk about your own personal upcoming projects, or where just you see yourself going next as an artist, as a Jew, as a comic book storyteller, as a human being?
Well, I'm looking for work. I have to worry about paying rent. The sad thing about comics is that they don't really pay well. And so most comic book professionals have day jobs. And so that was what originally got me into doing technology and kind of studying interaction design and user experience. I'm very interested in this whole move now of kind of everyone's talking about big data. I think it's important to have what I would call, or what's being called, narrative scientists, which are people that understand how to tell stories around data. I would love to follow the Scott McCloud kind of track of kind of using comics in completely different realms. So Forrest, if you're looking for any ideas, I think that there's just so many different ways that it can be deployed. And then right now I'd like to do just some small projects. That's why, you know, working on the colonial comics idea is really good. Today I was just approached to adapt stained glass windows in a synagogue into a comic book. since stained glass has been used in kind of sequential ways to tell kind of liturgical stories and ritual settings. So that was something that just came across my path today, and I was like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." So I have ideas in my head of the stories that I want to tell. The first story I told was a biblical story, and then the second story I worked on was Harvey's story and my story together. So I feel like I've studied kind of antiquity, and I've studied from one of the best contemporary writers. Now maybe I've cut my teeth and learned enough to kind of fly out on my own. So I'm brewing some of the ideas, but I don't want to tip my hand yet. But I would like to do something non-Jewish based. I do know that.
That's fair enough. You've earned the right to do something non-Jewish based. You are now allowed to proceed into the next testament.
I feel like I've proven my credit.
You definitely have. Let me conclude by saying that we want to thank you, JT, for being here, for providing us insight behind not the Israel my parents promised me. Very good. And if people have an interest in discussing religion and oh, wait a minute, and he's also showing his original work, Megillah Esther. Very good. The story
makes the wonderful Hanukkah.
Let me also say, if people viewing this are interested in the discussion of where religion and comics meet, if you can't be part of our class here at Tufts University, the experimental college offering religion and the graphic novel, you can always buy Graven Images, Religion, and Comic Books and Graphic Novels co-edited by myself. Yeah, not bad, huh? Not bad.
Very, very smooth.
Very smooth. They had to read it. The people watching this have the option to read it, but G. Willow Wilson did contribute to it. It's worth mentioning that if people have follow-up questions, both here in the class or following online, they can email JT Waldman at jtwaldman@gmail.com. I want to thank publisher Dr. Julian Darius of Sequart Research and Literacy Organization. I also want to thank those people that were just part of the chat, viewing it here in the Google Hangout chat room, perhaps those that were following via YouTube. That's it. We're done. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, JT.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.